Welcome everybody to the webinar that we are having in August this year. So this one is going to be a part of our How They Did It series that we are calling Reduce Customer Onboarding from 3 weeks to 8 hours. Quick note about logistics. This is going to be a very informal kind of like discussion style webinar. So as you have questions, feel free to put them into the question and answer panel. I'll do my best to get to them as we're going through, but otherwise we'll have some question and answer time at the end of it as well, so we can go through and answer anybody's questions. But without further ado, I would like to allow our guest speaker to introduce himself. So Kyle Partlo, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, glad to see everybody. And so my name is Kyle Partlo. I am the team manager for what we call our BPM team, Business Process Management team, as well as I manage our data engineering group at Gordon Food Service. Been at Gordon Food Service about 5.5 years, and looking forward to talking to you guys more about our Appian journey, and specifically on how we onboard customers.
Cool, thank you very much. To give a little bit of background about just Mastodon and just kind of how we arrived at this particular series, my name is Colin Schoenfelder. I am the Director of Technology at Mastodon. I'll allow Martin to introduce himself as well.
Sure. My name is Martin Mock. I am a Director of Professional Services at Mastodon, specifically broad markets and a good portion of our commercial portfolio. I've been working with Kyle for about 3 years now, to maybe a little more, to automate a number of workflows at Gordon. So kind of here to fill in any gaps that we haven't touched on. So
great, thanks. And yeah, so just to give a little bit of more context on how we kind of arrived at this series at the beginning. So we have been in business for a little over 12 years now, and over that time we have built out many different applications for a lot of different types of customers, and that really goes into a lot of different types of workflows. Right here we have a couple of different high-level verticals, so financial services, healthcare, manufacturing, but really this is quite expansive into a lot of different types of industries. And so as part of this series, we really wanted to go through and highlight a lot of the different project success stories that we've had in the past, and just give a little bit of context into how this process actually works. How you go from, I have some sort of a business challenge, into introducing automation at the beginning, and then sort of how that rollout actually plays out. And so it's been a really great series that we've been able to have in order to really highlight some of those stories with our customers. I'm so very excited, Kyle, to have you join us and talk about this one here. And just as a quick note, we do have anybody who is in attendance right now. You do have access now to go through and do what we call our workflow performance assessment. And so it's basically just to get a bit of understanding about what can automation bring to an organization, where we kind of go in and take a little bit of insight into what your workflows are now and provide a little bit of documentation about what the to-be process could be. But yeah, I'll jump out of the presentation for now and kind of get straight into actual questions. So first of all, Kyle, can you give us a little bit of background into just Gordon's industry and just what sort of offerings that you have for your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gordon Food Service is a company that's been around for 125 years. We are in the food distribution business. So think pretty much anybody that buys food in bulk could be a potential customer of ours. Restaurants, schools, jails, hospitals, cruise lines, etc., are all customers of ours. We also have in the United States a stores business, which is certainly the smaller piece of the pie when it comes to our business, and that is a differentiator for us. So most people think of GFS as the stores, but in reality, when you go out to eat, obviously there's a chance that food was distributed by Gordon Food Service. But like I said, been around for 125 years. Fun fact, we're still owned by the Gordon family, and we now have our first non-Gordon family member CEO in its history. So 123 years, I think we went with Gordon family members, and they're still very involved. They're still owners of the company. And we're based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where I'm located as well.
Gotcha. Okay. And so then sort of, clearly if you've been around for that long, you've had a lot of opportunity to sort of reflect and change the way that your business works and grow over time. As part of this sort of more recent effort into going into automation technologies, can you talk about maybe some of what the initial challenges that led you into, pursuing things like Appian, things like RPA? Like, what were some of those challenges that you had that drove you towards automation?
Yeah. So interestingly, our Appian journey didn't start as an automation one. It really just started as we had a couple of small applications that we wanted to build as a part of a separate program, that we really needed what we thought was a workflow tool. So we went out and we evaluated a bunch of different workflow tools, Appian being one of them, and we came into an agreement with Appian to build those two tools. And we thought Appian was a workflow tool. The more and more we got into it, the more and more the team got familiar with using Appian, the more we realized that it's actually way more than that. It's more of a low-code application development tool, but has a really strong workflow component within it. So, like I said, it wasn't part of an automation strategy at all. The automation strategy came later. That was part of our organizational efficiency, what we call must-win battle. And it really, that was branded as an RPA strategy, specifically leveraging Blue Prism, which is one of the RPA tools. And it started out as a separate team. And we went down that, we started building these automations. And then we went to a user group and someone gave us the idea to say, and they said, we actually have our RPA team. It's the same team as our Appian team because they're both low-code development platforms. The development experience is very similar, and the types of problems that both of those technologies solve are very similar as well. So it wasn't until that insight that we actually joined our Appian and kind of attached it to our automation strategy. And that's really gone extremely well so far. As a matter of fact, all of our developers, the intent is to have them cross-trained across both, because we want them to be able to work a process end to end, because we now realize that often automation problems require Appian or RPA, more often a hybrid of both. So it really wasn't until then that we joined Appian, we attached Appian to our automation strategy, and we've really enjoyed that so far.
Sure. Out of curiosity, like what was the time period from when you originally sort of like took Appian and started to use it for the smaller apps before you kind of realized a little bit later what that overall potential was? Like what kind of what year were we talking about?
So I think we started with Appian, it probably was in 2018, around then. And it probably was a good year and a half that Appian operated as an Appian development team until we got that insight from the partner at the Appian user conference that we joined them together. And then we started hiring RPA developers in conjunction with Appian. And then after a while, we said, they really should be cross-trained. So it took a little bit, but it was really thought of as two separate things until that insight.
Yeah, and I definitely want to ask you a little bit more about just sort of, how you used RPA in a little bit. I totally agree though that, merging those two technologies together, like the low code side and the just RPA in general side, is definitely something which is really compound benefits. But I guess, so what was sort of, when you were making that transition into thinking about it as part of a more broad automation strategy, was that around one particular type of application or one particular application or effort, or how did you figure out which process that you wanted to introduce more automation to, like from the Appian perspective?
Which process? So how do we determine which process we wanted to introduce Appian to?
Right, or I suppose like when you sort of moved from those smaller applications to thinking about it as part of a larger picture, how did that process work? What was the application that you thought to implement using?
Yeah. So after we built the initial applications, they went really well, and they solved the problem, and we learned just the capabilities of Appian. Me and the Scrum Master kind of got together and said, like, how do we grow Appian? There's so much value that we can get out of this tool. How do we get the next project? How do we make people aware of the capabilities of what the platform and the team can do? And at the time, the biggest project for us was SAP. The organization was working on implementing SAP across the company, and that was really getting most of the attention in terms of funding, in terms of priority, et cetera. So we set out to say, how can we make an impact there? What problems do they have that we think that we can help solve? And one thing that very quickly became apparent as we started asking people on what problems they haven't solved yet is SAP is not great when it comes to external parties interfacing directly with SAP. And in our instance, it's customers and vendors that we interact with the most, because we are the distributor. So we buy food and then we resell it to our customers, being restaurants or whatever the customer might be. So we said, all right, how can we help there? And it was specifically well, we need a way for our vendors to give us data. We need a way for our customers to give us data to set up customers, vendors, and what we call material or our products. So then we honestly, when we started and we said, yep, we were going to use Appian, we think this can solve this problem. It has a component of workflow. We thought the applications were going to be small, I'll be honest, in the moment, maybe even medium. And the more and more we got into it, the more and more complex it became. And now they're fully fledged applications that are very large. And again, if you'd asked me when we started with Appian, I would have said there's no way it could have handled an application of that size and scope. And now specifically, you know, with customer, it's gone off extremely well and handles the complexity very well, which is much more than we anticipated when we first started. But it was really, how do we piggyback off of the momentum that the organization has around SAP? And that, and that we started there, and then we found our use case that we thought we could make an impact on.
And
Gotcha.
you know, small starts, wasn't that kind of where we started with the app in a day, which maybe you had also, I think you had also heard from like a partner conference as well, right? Where we kind of, I mean, didn't think, you know, we'd actually get it done in a day, but
yeah,
I guess you want to talk about kind of how that started or how that what that idea was.
Yeah, it was actually funny enough, the same conference that, and it might have even been the same people that turned us onto that idea to do this app in a day idea. And they brought this up, and they may have even presented on it. It might have just been a hallway conversation, but they said, yeah, you know, Appian, it's great, it's fast, you can develop extremely quickly. We do this app in a day thing. And it was, you know, me and one of our developers were there, and we started asking them questions. And I think it was within 3 weeks from when we got back from that conference that we had our first app in a day. And the name may be a little bit misleading, because I do believe there are some applications you could build end to end in a single day. But I think we've done it maybe 2. And really, we've never left with an application that we're like, hands off, we're done, that thing's deployed, it's in production. But the benefits that you do get is we really cram probably 2 to 3 weeks of meetings into a single day. And the business people are in the meeting, our developers are in the meeting, our scrum masters in the meeting, our analysts in their meeting, and we are live building and asking questions. The developer, as they're writing something, they can look up and say, oh, how do you want this to work? And the business person can answer the question. So we really leave with cramming all of that information gathering into a single day as opposed to 3 weeks. We have a great start. We have what the user interface will look like. We have a rough idea of what the database structure needs to look like. But honestly, for me, the biggest benefit of App in a Day is we leave having a really great understanding of the problem the business is trying to solve. And probably more importantly, at least from my shoes, is the business leaves thinking IT finally understands what we're asking them to do, which for anybody in IT knows that is certainly a problem that we've encountered in the past. So that, in my opinion, is the biggest benefit. Albeit, you know, certainly it shrinks the size of the project, and it also forces you to get really specific on scope, because you only have effectively 9-hour day maybe. So you got to be really specific on what's the smallest problem we can solve in one day, and the App in a Day really helps with that.
Yeah, and I think just having, sort of that concrete structure around it also, especially if you're dealing with, business units who haven't built out custom software before, I think, having people go through the exercise of building something into a system really makes you reflect upon how concrete all of the different steps on it, like what is actually important to this process. And then, understanding that it's probably not going to be something that is going to actually roll out at the end of the day. Still, it gives you an understanding of priority that then you can sort of move through embracing the idea of an MVP and rolling things out over time.
It's funny that you said that, Colin, because the first App in a Day we did, it was with a group that has never been involved in a software build process before, right? Mm-hmm. So like they didn't even know what questions they needed to become prepared to answer. Right. I think if we would have done it through a normal development cycle, they probably would have said, why does IT keep asking us these corner case questions? And I'm really annoyed. I have to answer these emails. Where the App in a Day, they were there seeing the sausage get made and seeing why I have to ask this question, because I have to pick how I'm going to build this on the screen. So I think it added a lot of empathy and understanding for what the development process is for a group that wasn't familiar with that at the start.
Right. And another thing, which I think, is often the way that we try and approach these problems, the fact that you have sort of the people that are actually going to be doing the development interfacing directly with people that are, in the business, so that you can really have that, that cross understanding too, because, not only can the business side understand some of the technical limitations, but also just, from the technical side, understanding what the intent behind some of the things that you're building is, I think is very important as well.
Yep.
And, my understanding also is that, and you've mentioned it before, you're talking about customer, and then there's also like vendor and then materials. My understanding is that you actually started working on one process for materials management, but then that actually wasn't the one that ended up going to production first. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how that priority kind of like shifted around, or how that went through?
Yeah, so back in 2020, there's this pandemic. They called it COVID.
Never heard of it.
Google it if you haven't heard of it. But that came around, and we were in the midst of our SAP implementation and building material and vendor. COVID hit, we paused our SAP build. And one thing that I'm super excited about, and I give the credit to the team, is we when we said, all right, that's paused, funding is paused across the board, stop everything you're doing. The team very quickly said, well, how can we make an impact? What can we do? What can we build in order to make an impact on the organization? For the only project we were working on just got paused. And so at the time, that was this digital only pilot. And for us, our business model has been historically a salesperson is assigned to a customer. They come into your office or your restaurant once a week, once a month, whatever the cadence. You have someone that you can call. We started this pilot to have digital only customers, where they interface the same way that you do with Amazon or whatever e-commerce site that you work with. You don't have a salesperson that calls you. You do everything via the web page or the app. So that was one of the few things that was continuing to grow even through the pandemic. And we said, we need a way to set up customers. Our current process takes weeks, and it has all of these direct salesperson or inside sales rep connection points. We need to digitize that process. So this whole project started with that, only setting up one zip code, less than 100 customers, set them up through this digital process, which was fairly small in scope. So within about 3 months, we went live with customer onboarding after we shifted off of building the material and the vendor setup process. Within 3 months, we went live with that. And again, it was successful in solving the problem that we set out to solve for that small scope. Then once that was done, someone was crazy enough to say, how different is setting up a normal customer than just a digital only one? And there were certainly nuances, but it really wasn't as complicated as I probably would have thought prior to starting the digital only process.
Right.
So the team dug in, they found out what needs to be added, what needs to be changed to do that. And then we started down that path. And then, a few months after that, we went live for all customers across all of our distribution network to get set up through this Appian process that this team built out of the digital only project. And so I think the takeaway there is, I think if we would have set out to build a customer onboarding process for all types of customers, the scope would have ballooned so big, it would have taken forever to build, right? Where we started with a very small and specific project. We didn't let the next thing get in the way of making progress on the first problem. We were able to solve that. It wasn't until we solved it and we went live that we sat back and said, well, was that successful or not? Should we keep investing or should we stop? That we started to add things on. And as a result, it's gone. The business continues to this day to invest, even to the point where we don't even have to ask that much anymore, because everyone is aware of the success. And I'll talk more about the metrics later, the success of this project. I think if we would have gone down the path of trying to build what we have right now before we went live, there's no way we would have had the continued investment. It's because they gave us $1. 3 months later, we gave them back $5. Okay, here's another $1. All right, here's another $5. Rinse and repeat over and over again. And it's really Appian and the team and the process and the technology that we've built that has enabled us to build these things quickly, deploy them fast, and take what would have taken years in a custom development environment and do it in months in a technology like Appian.
Right. And, I think that also, first of all, that is exactly where that, the tagline for the webinar comes from, the 3 weeks to 8 hours. The fact that it's something that people can do self-service, I think, is huge in order to be able to increase that the throughput there. And also my understanding is sort of you also took somewhat of a regional approach, or maybe not even in that application in particular, but in some of the other ones that you have implemented since then. Trying to take a region and roll out to some subset of customers or vendors.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you chose to do that and how effective that was?
Yeah, so that really wasn't an Appian team decision. That's more of a SAP rollout strategy. So I don't pretend to be an SAP expert. Not certain that is a tagline that I want, but that was a decision that was made at the organization level to go after the divisional rollout for SAP, to not expose our business to the amount of risk that comes with such a major overhaul of our internal systems. So that is something that the Appian team has had to build around, though. How do we handle some divisions live on SAP, some divisions on legacy applications, some on US, some on Canada? How do we handle situations where we buy product into one division and sell it out of another? That's all complexity that the Appian team, credit to them, has had to handle and find a way to manage. On Sunday, that division is on the legacy system. On Monday, it's on SAP. How do we set up items managing across all those things, and the technology and the team and the processes that we built has really enabled us to manage an extremely complex environment through this interim state, while continuing to try to make tomorrow a better day when we think about our end state solution that we want to ultimately get to.
Right. And absolutely, I think, that approach of kind of like phasing things out and doing a rollout to, sets of customers, it also just gives you an opportunity to get really good feedback, from how this is actually going to work for end users, and then incorporate that into the application before you try and do this gigantic thing. I think most of the time when customers, we're trying to coach that exact kind of a thing, right? Like, we can't necessarily roll out to or it would not be advisable anyway, to roll out to every single person in an organization or to every single customer. Let's go through, figure out some of our most trusted customers or best base, roll it out to them and kind of iterate on it from there. And as a side note, I do see that we've had a couple of questions come in. I'm going to get to those, I think, at the end of the presentation. So bear with me on that. But coming into it, so again, I think that you were talking a little bit about that transition time. So how are you going to from one day, using the legacy system to the next day using the new one? Can you talk a little bit about like how that worked with, making sure that you didn't interrupt the day-to-day delivery? How did you inform people, that this was going to be a change that was coming down the line? Did you get a lot of pushback or buy-in into that process, and how that all worked?
Yeah. So for this particular instance, we really didn't change a whole lot about the process. This was a manual process that the teams were executing. And so the good news is we didn't have to train a whole lot on, this is what we need to do to set up a customer. It was more of just, here's the new application that does the same thing that you used to do, just in a more automated and structured manner through the Appian application that we built. Which I think when training on a brand, we've never done this process before. That certainly has its challenges, but instead it's like, yep, here's the Appian process. This is where it does the thing that you used to do manually. This is where it does the thing that you used to do manually. And so we really didn't interrupt too much. And especially the fact that we started with digital only, we got out there, we got those initial like easy bugs that it would have been really nice to catch them development process. But when we went live across our whole distribution network, we had addressed a lot of those really small things, because those are the ones that users start to lose confidence. But by now it's only a small number of sales reps, a small number of customers, we're able to weed through those initial issues before we went live with the big bang for everybody. And it really went smooth, I believe, as a result of keeping that initial go live really small.
One of the things that I really like about kind of the design of that customer onboarding system is, it's of course Appian's kind of integrating and orchestrating just a whole lot of different systems, and you guys have built it so that an end user can see everything that's going on, including like the integration calls, which are very technical, but like sometimes they'll spit out error messages, and a user can actually go in and see kind of exactly where it is, what happened, what didn't happen. And that sort of visibility has probably helped to gain, also help with the training, but also like just gain a lot of the trust of the users about, hey, here's what's actually going on. It's not some black box that, data gets thrown into. This is what it's doing. It's just doing it automated for you.
Yeah,
So,
and I think if you ask the team, that was actually one that Macedon worked with us very closely on. Is I forget what we call it, but it's essentially because it's really an orchestrator of a process and touches
yeah,
all those different applications.
yeah.
We effectively have a log that our users can see.
Mhm.
It's not just a technical thing, because the issue was somewhere in the process something broke or something gave us bad information, and it took a lot of time for the business to identify it, them to ask us what went wrong, us to go through the internal guts of Appian and the way it's working to say, oh, that integration failed. You put 6 characters instead of 5. Where instead we give them the information and a chronological list of every time it interfaces with an external application. So they can go and say like, oh, I put 6 characters instead of 5. I can change
Yeah.
it to 5, reprocess, and we're not even in the loop. And since then,
Right.
we've added that capability that you referred to every new application
Yeah.
that we built, where it makes sense, obviously. But that was a huge win,
Yeah.
and I credit working with the Mastodon team to help us build out that capability.
Yeah, and I think that, on a technical side, but as well as just, from a business side, having that sort of audit history onto everything that has happened as part of, some sort of a job, be it like a customer onboarding process or whatever is going to be, downstream from that, having everybody be able to go to one place and have an instant understanding of everything that has occurred over time really gives everybody a much better understanding of what needs to happen, what gaps are, and gives people the ability to actually take action on information that they're able to see without feeling like they're just missing something, and so I think that that's huge as well. And I do want to get back to talking about RPA. So you're talking about how automation was really, at Gordon is seen as the combination of sort of the low code platforms as well as, RPA. Can you talk a little bit more about how you are using RPA? I understand that you definitely use it to, integrate with a number of other kinds of systems, and especially in like a stopgap scenario. Can you talk a little bit about like how you've used RPA with SAP and just sort of the other kind of efforts that you have there?
Yeah, absolutely. So RPA, certainly there are a lot of things that we build that are standalone RPA applications. In the example of Appy, or I'm sorry, of customer onboarding, that was an example where when we were building it, remember, our staff got cut overnight as a result of COVID. So as we were building, we said we need an API to interface with this application to set up this customer, and we can't do this process without that. And so we said, hey, can we get an API written, or can you provide us that information so that we can interface with you? And sometimes the answer was, yeah, we already have one, which is obviously, wouldn't we love it if that was always the case? But in a lot of instances, it's like that API doesn't exist. We can build it for you. We have a backlog that's 9 months long, and we just got our development cut in half. So we kind of were faced with a decision, right? And so what we did was we actually started using RPA instead of those API calls, which granted, it was certainly slower. Logging into an application, typing in customer information, hitting submit takes a lot longer than an API call, but it was at least possible in the moment. So I think when we went live with customer onboarding, we had 3 or 4 RPA processes that we would have preferred to be API calls. There certainly were issues, as there is with RPA processes. It certainly took longer, but at least it was possible. And so we went live with 3 to 4, and since then, I think we've eliminated all of them, if not most of them, and replaced them with APIs. So lesson learned there is, if we wouldn't have done that, we would have been 9 months, 12 months, 18 months out from ever turning on customer onboarding. Instead, within 3 months, we were able to go live, get this thing running, start getting the value, get the lessons learned early. And then the application just got better as we went because we replaced those RPA processes with the direct API calls.
Right. Yeah, and I think that that's definitely a common theme that we see with RPA and how people use it. I think the last one of these series that we did was talking a lot about RPA and how it was, sort of, you are dealing with systems who don't have integration teams at all, right? And you're a bunch of bespoke systems that you're collecting similar information from, but it's very difficult to build out those sort of APIs. So absolutely, think that's a great use case for where to use RPA and doing those sort of transitions over to more robust integrations. And earlier you were talking a little bit about metrics as well, or you alluded to it. I'd love to come back to that. It sounds like, you know, at this point you've had a couple of applications that have gone live. You've certainly been using it, and you know, just the overall 3 weeks to 8 hours. But when you first, you know, were setting out on the endeavor, did you have specific metrics in mind that you were trying to meet, or were those something that you sort of developed over time, or and how did that process work, and how do you measure them now?
Yeah, so the main objective for us, even before we built this application, there was always a desire to, you know, customer experience and make it easy for them to do business with us. And in my opinion, probably one of the most important experiences for them is the onboarding process. I know if I logged into an e-commerce website and I submitted my credentials and it took 3 weeks before I could place an order, I would probably find somewhere else to buy whatever I was buying. So it was always an important thing, and nobody at that point in time, nobody had taken on the challenge. And funny enough, we didn't intentionally take on the challenge either. It wasn't, it was part of another project that we realized that this was then possible. So for us, it's how long does it take? How long does it take from the time a customer says, I want to do business with GFS, to the time that they can place an order? And so yeah, like the title of this talk said, we took it from about 3 weeks, from the time they submitted the form to the time that they could place an order. And we got that down. I think 8 hours is even old data. I think it's the average is closer to less than 4. I think my Scrum Master, Jeff, was telling me that we even have instances of 10 minutes of setting up customers. That's really the number one thing. And remember the environment that we were in when we went live with this. This was peak COVID. And as you can imagine, restaurants were heavily impacted by COVID. A lot of them had to shut down to ultimately reopen. So for lack of a better phrase, our industry was a little bit up for grabs. There were a lot of customers that never had considered changing their food distribution provider to now needing a new one. So we believe that we won business as a result of us being able to set up customers faster. In peak COVID, when you didn't have an income stream, you now can reopen your restaurant for the first time in however long. Are you going to take the provider that can send you something next week, or are you going to take the provider that can't even get you set up for a few weeks?
Right.
So we believe we really won a lot of business as a result of that, but we will always measure the success of this and how long does it take to set them up as a customer, specifically for the customer onboarding process.
Right. And out of curiosity, just kind of like more on a like the technical note of things, are people coming in as Appian users, or are they using like an external system that are then registering them in the system, or how does that work?
I'm gonna have to reach a little bit here because I would definitely certainly not qualified to answer that entirely. But I do know we have a centralized authentication process, again, reaching a little bit, that we use across all of our customer facing applications. So it's the same credentials that you log into customer onboarding that you'll log into our e-commerce website. That wasn't true initially. Again, we went live with certainly not a complete solution. It was initially authenticated only through Appian, and we've since changed to use that centralized, I'm just going to say technology because I'm going to make a fool of myself if I try to repeat the name of it. And we've since moved to that, which again, from a customer experience standpoint is great. I don't want to have to manage my different logins to deal with the same company. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay. And so then how about, you know, just in terms of like other outcomes that you had? So for sure, this sounds like it was a great, you know, measure of success, you know, how easy it is for people to get onboarded into the system. Were there other kinds of positive outcomes that you didn't expect necessarily, maybe from not just sort of that application in particular, but maybe with working with, you know, Appian or just kind of those automation technologies more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said in my intro, I'm also involved in our data and analytics strategy. So data quality is something that as that strategy continues to develop, we feel the pain more and more. And poor data quality and master data is brutal when it comes to trying to predict stuff in an advanced analytics environment.
Right.
So by taking it out of Google Sheets and email and multiple different systems and centralizing it, and also leveraging the power of Appian to do data validations, is really improved our data quality. One example is our customer addresses. Our customer addresses were a disaster. I don't even know how that was possible, but some of them didn't exist. Some of them weren't complete. Some of them didn't have, you know, a litany of issues. And so with Appian, we were able to very easily do, the type ahead as your, I'm not sure it's type ahead, but we validate the address is an actual legitimate address. And that's just one example. Across the board, we can validate much easier than our historical processes. So data quality is the first one. The second one is we've digitized the process. If someone were to ask you before, what are the details of setting up a customer? How long does it take? Well, let me go sift through my email. Let me look at this Google Sheet. Let me ask 6 other people. Where now, because we've digitized that process, we can tell you exactly what takes the longest. Where should we spend our time? Who's responsible for this customer getting set up? We have just access to data that you don't have when you don't have it in a structured environment like Appian. It's also reduced the burden on our internal team. Like I said, we had a team. It wasn't because it did take a while to set them up, but we had stacked so many behind, we couldn't even start working on your onboarding application for weeks. So the result of that is we've reduced their backlog so they can start working on a new application the same day we get it in. So not only we reduced the wait time, we've also reduced the execution time. The wait time was eliminated as a result of us reducing the execution time significantly. So it's reduced the burden on the internal team so they can focus on doing more valuable work. And we've eliminated our customer backlog. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was within like 2 weeks. We took a 3-week backlog and eliminated it, which was, that honestly got people clearly super excited. And then also things just don't get dropped with a robust workflow. We have reporting that the managers that are responsible for this process can go in and see like which customers have been in a step for too long. This customer's beyond the SLA. We expect our customer to be set up in 4 days. This one's at day 6. Who's responsible for it? Who do I need to talk to move this along? Really just giving that visibility and also that structure to not have to, I have to remember I have that email or that task written in my notes to handle this customer. With having it in a structured environment like Appian, it gives visibility and helps us make sure we don't drop customers. And that if someone's not getting treated fairly, or I'm sorry, if a customer wasn't getting set up in an appropriate amount of time, before the only way we knew that is if the customer called us really mad, or they just withdrew their application because it took too long. Now we are on top of our game in regards to managing our customers and their process through onboarding.
Okay, yeah, just like right back to the beginning of what you were saying about data validation and then, just data cleanliness. It is always amazing how big of a difference it can make, something which seems like it's relatively simple. Like I was entering something into a spreadsheet. Now I'm entering similar information, but into a form that has some basic data validation. It's amazing how much of a difference that alone can make, for sure. And absolutely, kind of being able to map out the process, kind of like what we were talking about, earlier, just in the beginning of it, getting business buy-in into what this overall process is going to look like, and then actually having a good understanding of what it looks like end to end makes it just so much easier to train people, so much easier to get people onboarded into the system. And I guess, kind of, we've talked about this a little bit more, but maybe to ask a bit more explicitly, the business users and the folks that were, kind of onboarding all of these people, did they have, like, how did they respond to the initial rollout? Was it something that was, went over very well? Was there any like pushback on it, and what kinds of reactions did you get out of the business?
Yeah, I think so. For the digital only go live, I think there was certainly people were talking, right? In terms of, people that were close to the digital only pilot understood the value, they understood what it did, and they were certainly excited about it. And then it wasn't until we went live with the customer onboarding process for our entire network that people really started to talk. For example, our business partner would regularly send out updates and metrics on how long it's taking, how many customers are in the backlog. And like I said, over a couple of week time frame, it shrunk significantly. And a lot of senior leaders were getting that information. And so obviously people started asking the question, like, what did we do? What did we change? Why are these metrics suddenly, seemingly overnight, getting way better? Then, once people started figuring out and see it actually working and actually doing what we intended to do to the fullest extent, is when people started really getting exciting and saying, if they can do that, what else can they do? What other applications or what other capabilities can we add to customer onboarding? And then we just started getting people come out of the woodwork asking for new applications, new features. regularly in this application and outside as well.
Right.
Sky's the limit at that point.
And actually, that kind of leads well into the next question, which is actually the final question that I had prepared for you, which was, it sounds like you're continuing to build out new functionality and build into other, business units. Can you talk a little bit about, what kind of pipeline that you have now and maybe just how you prioritize between different projects that you have coming up?
Yeah, so that is certainly something that's becoming more and more challenging. When we had a team of 2 and 2 applications that weren't even built yet, it was fairly easy to manage the intake of ideas. But now we've got, I think, 16 Appian applications and a litany of RPA processes as well. And so we have a lot of product owners. We have a lot of applications that all want us to prioritize their stuff.
Right.
So we recently brought in a product owner specifically to lead our automation strategy and evaluate new opportunities. And he's really helped add some rigor to our process and coach us as well as the business on what does a good business case look like? What are the value levers? Is this an efficiency gain? Are we going to reduce costs? Are we going to make more money? Are we going to make customers happy? And really help build some rigor around the process in which we evaluate those ideas. Because we have to prioritize not only within the application, which is fairly easy because our business process owner makes that decision, but we also have to prioritize across all of our applications. If you've got an opportunity for $50,000 a year, that's great for your application, but we've got opportunities that are significantly higher than that in other applications. And we have to guide them to that as well so that they understand, like, listen, we're not ignoring you. If you were in our situation or you own the company, which opportunity would you rather go after?
Right.
And so obviously that is certainly a challenging as we grow more and more, but fortunately we continue to get funding to build these things out. And it's really helping coach us as well as the business that we're not just going to do stuff because it sounds like a good idea. We have to have metrics and evaluation behind it to justify spending the money to ultimately to build out the feature that you want in your application.
Yeah, absolutely. Once people start to understand, the huge value that introducing like an automation or introducing that kind of process can have, it really gets people's, ideas churning, and you start getting a ton of things after that. It can definitely be difficult to manage that many people also just getting people to understand like that this needs to be fully formed, and that whole process of like we were talking about with app in a day and understanding what it actually means to implement these things and gathering requirements and getting clarity of that vision as you're executing that is definitely something which is for sure a challenge. But great. Well, that's actually all of the questions that I had prepared. We do have some questions coming in from the audience. So let me bring this up really quick. So the first one that we have, and I'll kind of share my screen a little bit just to give a little bit of context as I'm kind of sorting through these. So this is, one of the different, or one of the webinars that we do. We do have a large series of webinars that we have posted, and we also do other kinds of different, events and just kind of like webinars, different showcases of functionality that we have and use cases and things like that. So feel free to check that out. The first question that I have here is maybe a quasi-technical question about just how to do security and access. So regarding scope, do you have any thoughts on capturing data access requirements and least privilege access to the data, especially in a cloud first or zero trust customer environment? So and then e.g. limiting scope creep in user roles or development process. And so maybe Kyle, for you, with regard to that, like, how do you figure out, who should have access to what, and how do you do that kind of, security assessment about, who has access to what data? Is that a complicated process?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to have any game-changing advice on something that we've done well here. I think it's really, the first thing is obviously evaluate the sensitivity of the data. Like we have one process that holds banking information. So obviously we're going to spend some additional time and rigor to evaluate how do we have access? Do we obfuscate data? How do we make sure that we contain the role and who has access to it and who the approvers are? And then obviously as we build applications that don't necessarily have that amount, how do we involve the business that owns the data in the approval of those roles so that if someone within our team gets access to an application that they shouldn't, ultimately it was the owner of the data that was responsible for approving that person's access. Because
Right.
I don't want to have that burden of making decisions on who should and shouldn't have access to our banking information application. So I think involving them in the process of the approval to get access, again, I'm not sure I'm going to have any super insightful things, but at least that's the way I think about it. And I'm certainly not directly involved in the process in which we design the roles. That's certainly something that we work with our business to determine. But it's really the first step is the sensitivity level, and how rigorous do we need to be to control access to this data?
Yeah, I can say that, it's definitely a push and pull, especially with something like Appian, where so much of the benefit is the fact that you're able to have a number of different types of applications and have, as a user, a pretty seamless experience being able to log in, see all of the pieces of information that you are that are pertinent to you. One of the strategies from, more of a technical perspective that we always try and employ is kind of separating between the idea of a functional group or a permission. Like I, as a function, have access to, kick off this action or to see this piece of data, and being very explicit about assigning, permissions to that functional group. And then when you have a role group, as in like, this is, me as director of technology, or me as, somebody who's in, whatever department, assigning all of the, kind of nesting the group structure in it so that it's very easy to see, okay, anybody who is in this particular role group is going to have access to this set of functionality and this set of, screens, and being very explicit with it like that. So it's definitely something which, is a challenge, especially when you're trying to balance between, those different, the different advantages that you get. But yeah, really good question.
Yeah, a little bit. So fortunately, my Scrum Master is in this call, and he chatted me the real answer that I should have given. So he did say that we do our authentication based on job code. So again, for us, like a cost analyst, they should have access to a specific thing. You don't get added to the application, you get added to the cost analyst group, and we know cost analysts should have so that way for us, we're managing one quote person, when our business manager is managing who has access to that role, assuming that they should have access to that role, then they can only see the data that they should know.
Gotcha. Cool. So the next question that I have on here. So the question is, what tip can you provide someone in a similar situation to improve client onboarding? So I guess was asked a little bit earlier on in the process, but I guess maybe when you're kind of getting started, or when you're trying to approach just customer onboarding or client onboarding more generally, yeah, like what kind of tips would you have from your experience going through this?
Yeah. Can you repeat the original question just so I make sure I got it?
Sure. So what tip can you provide, or what tips can you provide to someone in a similar situation wanting to improve client onboarding?
Yeah. So I assume most people here are Appian users, so I'll answer it in a little bit of an Appian manner. But like I said before, start small. So what's the smallest thing that you can do to solve a problem within that process? Don't necessarily take on the whole thing. If it's for us, it's a multi-step process to be able to help to enable them to place an order. So you got 10 steps. Which is the one that takes the longest? Is there a way for us to automate that within Appian? Solve that problem. Go evaluate the value. Something that we're trying to get better at is, before we start a project, how are we going to measure value of what we're building? And what I've told our team is, I want a dashboard that has the big number across the top. We know every time we set up a customer, that saves us $100 or whatever the case might be. Okay, so I want a dashboard that says, take the number of customers that we've onboarded, multiply that by $100. Because when I go and want to request additional employees to add to this team, I get asked the question, justify it. Why should we add here? Why should we spend the money here as opposed to somewhere else? And if I can pull up a document that says, well, the team has saved us $500,000 over the past 6 months, that makes my job picking up. Exactly. So how do you start the value? I call it the value train, which sounds more ridiculous when I'm in a group of people than it does when I tell it to my team. But how do you start that? How do you measure that so that when you go and solve that one problem and you come back and say, you gave me $1, I gave you back 5 3 months later? How do you start that train and get people excited and knowledgeable about what you're doing so that you can continue to build on top of it? If you try to bite off too much scope, it's way harder to get the capital request approved. It's way harder to build it because there's so much complexity. How do you narrow it down to the smallest problem that you can find to make an impact on the process that you're trying to improve?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that it's great that you have such a concrete measure that you're going off of. Definitely, especially in some things when you're talking about experience, right? Like that can be a very difficult thing to measure from, just a high level time, even coming up with anything. Like, you're talking about like the time that it takes to onboard, is a great measure of experience. But, a lot of times it can be tricky at the beginning to figure out like, how are we going to measure like overall an experience of somebody. So I think that's a great strategy to take.
I kind of have a related question if I can. Gordon, so yeah, kind of related to that. So one thing that's still impresses me with Gordon. So you guys, pretty much all of technology operates in like a safe structure. So you have your PI planning events and you have your your program increments. And one thing that you guys have always been, I think, pretty successful in doing is getting that business buy-in to sit in a room for 8 hours a day for 2 days every quarter. Like that is impossible to get, and the example of like the app in a day, you were able to get the business to say, I'm not doing anything this day. I'm going to sit in a room for 9 hours and work with like, how do you do that? And that's happened with I think almost every product owner that we've dealt with. It's just, they've been, empowered and present and active and engaged. And, that's not necessarily the same situation for every project. So
yeah, I think from a safe standpoint, so safe scaled agile framework, which if you think of safe is really how agile teams work together. Agile is a team concept, safe is an enterprise concept. And so I fortunately was able to witness kind of our first go at safe. And I thought it was crazy. I thought, like, are you kidding around? You're going to get an entire department of over 250 people to take 2 days off, sit in a room and talk? What? Are you kidding? No way. No way that's going to happen. And so I did it, right? And then like leaving, I was like, that was awesome, right? And I think if you were to ask our business leaders what the value of safe is, their answer would be alignment. I know what the department is working on. They are directly involved up to our senior leader level in establishing the priorities for our program increment, which is a 13-week period of work. Where before they come and say, wait a second, I thought you guys were working on my thing. It's like, well, no, like this other, like nobody knew, nobody had control, nobody understood why did my thing get bumped in lieu of something else. Where PI planning, it's like, hey, I've got my thing. Someone else says, hey, we need to set up customers faster. My thing's important. It's definitely not as important as that. So it gained visibility for our senior leaders to see what the priorities were and gave them control as to what should and shouldn't be on that priority list, and gained alignment across our organization, especially across teams, on what the objectives are for the organization over the next 13 weeks. And our Appian team was actually right at the beginning as well of establishing SAFE. Now they're certainly one of the stronger agile and safe practicing teams at GFS.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely fascinating. Like figuring out how to scale things like agile up to that level is one of. I'm sure that we could do an entire webinar just talking about how that 3-day process goes. Maybe we'll investigate that a little bit more in the future. I do have another couple of questions to come through. So the next one, and this is another one which I think that maybe we've kind of answered a little bit in turn as we've gone through. But if there's anything to add. How would you recommend that I start something like this? Just thinking about starting or like it is overwhelming to think about starting because there is so much change or so much revamp. So I guess, like just kind of overcoming that initial, I guess, hesitation and, how much process there is going to be.
Yeah, that one's tough because even in my experience, when you try to start small, people always will come in and say, oh, well, what about that? Whoa, what about that? We can't go live unless we have this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
So it's a challenge. And I think we got a little lucky because we didn't have with our initial pilot, we didn't have the luxury of time to think about other things. This needed to get done quickly. The timetable kind of constrained us to. We just need to build something to solve this one problem. But it is hard to get people to hey, stop thinking about what's next. Let's get after this one problem. Let's do it quick. And honestly, for us, there is a version of this story that we could have built the digital only pilot. We would have said, it was kind of successful. we're not going to invest in that anymore, which frankly would have been fine by me. If our money is better, if our money and time is better spent elsewhere, I'm on board with that. But the good news is we would have known in 3 months, as opposed to sinking hundreds of thousands of dollars into a project that may have not been worth it. We knew within 3 months, and we continued to double down as a result. It would have been worse if we got to 9 months, realized it wasn't as valuable as we thought. We've all been a part of those projects that it didn't deliver on the value. And it gives our leaders the luxury of deciding, I'm going to stop investing in this because it didn't accomplish what we thought it was going to. I'll bet our leaders wish that happened more often. And frankly, I do too, because I don't want to have my name on a multi-$100,000 project that ended up being a complete flop either. So again, and also I think they're more willing, our leaders are more willing to approve those spend requests, because it's like, if it doesn't work out, I don't want to lose that money either, but at least it's a manageable amount as opposed to a huge capital spend request.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, it is always difficult to overcome that idea of like, we need to have, the embrace of the iterative value that you are getting out of it, and like really reflecting back on that. But I've never experienced anybody who has followed sort of that process that did not very, very much appreciate kind of taking that approach and not doing just say, we're going to build everything and then do a massive rollout. It's always so much more successful across, every different aspect when you try and do things in an iterative approach. We have 5 minutes left. I have one more question. So this one, I think we talked a bit about the, the business side reactions, asking about the customer side reactions. So can you share any memorable customer quotes or experiences about the new application, if you happen to have any of those?
Yeah, I wish I did off the top of my head. I do know that we do have some. We mostly ask questions of our business partners that were executing this process. And again, I don't have those off the top of my head. I wish I did. But yeah, so I don't have anything off the top of my head. But in general, as I mentioned before, excitement, eliminating the backlog. But I don't have any off the top. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the proof is in the pudding, really. If you continue to have people who are signing up through the end, interface, then, it clearly is showing that there is, so a lot of value that's being added to it.
Yeah.
But great. Well, that wraps up all the questions that we had in the backlog. Thank you very much, Kyle, for joining us today. Again, follow us on our various social medias. We do these kinds of webinars pretty frequently. Definitely the How They Did It series is one of the ones that we really enjoy a lot. And it's a great opportunity to come in and see, how different people are, working with not just Appian, but other just kind of, low code and just automation technologies. So thank you again very much, Kyle, for joining us, and everybody else. Thank you for joining us as well. And we'll see you in the next webinar.